So my name is Henrik Stenberg, and I'm from the Norwegian School of Economics, where I study business administration. And I've chosen to focus on global economics and entrepreneurship with the sub-teams of international finance and investment in China. So I have labeled my presentation Belt and Road Economics, and my research question is how the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has affected debt sustainability and the financial soundness of the recipient countries. So the Belt and Road Initiative, in short, is a Chinese-led infrastructure project which was initiated in 2013 by President Xi Jinping of China. It includes around 60% of the world's population and includes around 1/3 of the world's total GDP and global trade. Africa, Asia, and Europe are the three main continents which are included in this project. And notably, the US is not included, as China and the US are seen as main opponents on the international global arena. Furthermore, Latin America is partly involved in the BRI. So the main goals and ambitions of this project is to reduce the travel times of the involved countries, reduce poverty, increase the rate of development, as well as gain access to capital in the member or recipient countries. So in my essay, I have focused on the concepts of neocolonialism and debt trap diplomacy. So there are several risks related to the extension of Chinese debt to other foreign countries. And there have been raised issues around debt sustainability and whether or not the debt extended is sustainable in a longer term for the recipients. There have also been raised questions about servitude for the recipient countries and whether or not good governance principles are upheld from China's point of view. Moving on, the question of debt trap diplomacy has been raised in relation to Sri Lanka. So a couple of years back, China extended quite a lot of debt to to Sri Lanka, which they were not able to pay back in full. And because of that, they later on took control of one of their main ports. And this has been labeled debt trap diplomacy. Whereas neocolonialism, on the other hand, is a concept where China has become, some critics argue China has become a new colonializer, and that the BRI project, the Belt and Road Initiative, is of greater benefit to China as opposed to those receiving the loans to develop their infrastructure. Furthermore, in Guinea and Zambia, there have been examples of exploitation of workers, arrests of labor union workers, as well as you have to have 2 years of working experience in order to be eligible to receive protective gear and equipment. The counter argument, however, is proposed by Brautigan, who says that Sri Lanka, as a matter of fact, is the only country in which debt trap diplomacy has taken place, and that the main number of countries are actually positive recipients, and China is not a predatory lender. For example, in Angola was labeled as a host city by many Western powers, but when you took a longer-term perspective, people actually did move into those new buildings that were built, and people took use of the investments that were made in that country. Whereas Brautigan actually does admit that the case of Djibouti and the military base, which has been built there, could be a cause of concern, particularly for the US, as they have a military base quite close to that country. Brautigan is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and they have gone through more than 1,000 Chinese extended loans. And amongst all those loans, none of them have been so-called sour or bad loans, as she and her team have found. She does say yet that there are legitimate claims about neocolonialism and China being a threat in the South China Sea, which I will come back to a bit later in the presentation. Lastly, on this point, the roles once were reversed, as Japan was the country extending foreign debt and loans to China in the wake of the Cultural Revolution in 1978. As we all know, today China is the country extending loans and debts. So as we can see, the roles very well might be reversed in the longer run, and the outcome might be of benefit to those countries actually receiving the aid and debt. In 1978, Japan had quite strict terms for their loan agreements, saying you need to employ Japanese workers in order to get our capital. But the outcome was quite good for China in the long run. And then moving on, there's the concept of salami slicing theory, in which a country takes small steps using clandestine means in order to achieve a greater outcome not perceived by countries outside of the sphere of influence, being China in this case, which many claim is the case with the Belt and Road Initiative. And as I mentioned, many do also say this is the case with the South China Sea, where China has been taking on other countries' exclusive economic zones, and there are disputed border lines there, as seen by the 9-dash borderline dispute, and they have gone against maritime law and international law as well. Lastly, another author which I just recently explored as an article series in the Financial Times came out in this April, says there has been a surge of bad loans countering the argument of Breitigam, which I just presented. So further areas of investigation could have been China's relationship to Russia, and now also taken into account the war in Ukraine. I did briefly mention in my paper the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and how that bank helps in financing the BRI. But this could have been explored further, obviously. And also, as I mentioned, the South China Sea, which does say quite a lot about how the US know how China acts in relation to its neighboring countries and other countries on the international scene, and in relation to economics and financing policies. But this it fell without the scope of my primary research. So in conclusion, I think the stance we should take is a balanced one, because from a Western perspective, there have been quite a lot of critics against the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly those of debt trap diplomacy, salami slicing, and neocolonialism. But taking an Asian perspective, a Chinese perspective, and also an African perspective, many of the recipient countries are quite positive to get an influx of capital, to be able to develop their infrastructure project, their ports, and so on. So overall, I think the stance is more balanced than maybe Western powers and Western media do portray. Thank you so much. Yes? Questions? None? Yeah, okay.
I'm wondering, in your research, so it sounds like you're advocating both the neocolonialism and debt trap diplomacy perspectives seem apt to describe what's going on. Is that correct?
That's right.
And I guess I'm wondering, in your reading, if you came across discussions of direct intervention in governments along with the infrastructure investments, just thinking about the United States approach to some of these same kinds of influence questions in the past, which did very much involve direct, often clandestine supported, but intervention in governments that then would support U.S. business interests in the country. And so I guess I'm wondering, along with these perspectives, like, do we see after the investments in the country more Chinese, say, oriented businesses coming in to then profit additionally from these investments that are made? Do we see other kinds of influence on the governmental side, maybe direct or indirect? I'm just wondering if that, how those kinds of questions of additional influences beyond the financial
Absolutely.
are coming into these theoretical perspectives.
That's a very pertinent question. And I did actually look into that, researched on that, and wrote about that in my essay as well. And that particularly goes for African countries as far as I could see. So after a couple of years, they actually do demand that Chinese workers, and maybe from the beginning onwards as well, are employed, and they do get to say quite a lot in how the politics are run and the decision-making processes of those countries. And as I mentioned, they deployed a military base in Djibouti, for example. So yes, that is very much the case. As China being the stronger economic and political power, they do get a greater say because they get their capital. So those countries have to make a trade-off, and they find that getting an influx of capital, getting to develop their infrastructure, that then they can look through or disregard those other more negative factors and the terms and conditions the Chinese regime actually sets for those deals. So yes, I think that very much is the case, actually.
Thanks. And just one more suggestion of a country to look into in regards to the debt trap. And I only know a little bit about this because I have some relatives that live there. Montenegro or near there. In Europe, such a tiny little country, and their highway system was, anyway, I think, similar story to what you were describing with Sri Lanka, where they couldn't pay, on their debt. And so there were some stipulations that were then kicking in terms of control over this toll system of toll roads built. So anyway.
And that was from China as well. Yeah, so in Greece, actually, they suffered quite an extensive economic crisis some years back. And China has come in there as well, financing and funding a port. So even in those European ports and quite economically sound countries originally and members of the EU, even there China has, as I said, in Europe, become a player and an economic actor.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?